Dennis Wilson is best known as the drummer for the Beach Boys, and he's one of the Wilson brothers, along with Brian and Carl, who are the kind of majority in the Beach Boys. He was the only one in the band who was genuinely a surfer, and he tended towards a somewhat wild lifestyle. He was a friend, and then less of a friend and more of an associate of Charles Manson. In 1977, he released a solo album, which outsold contemporaneous Beach Boys albums. He died in 1983 whilst trying to dive whilst drunk. Hi, my name's Dan. This is a review of the album Pacific Ocean Blue by Dennis Wilson, which was released in 1977. It was his only solo album that was released during his lifetime, and it's my first time listening to it. There was a second solo album he worked on, but that didn't get finished and then didn't get released until 2017, which was after he died, obviously, and 40 years after this one, so a 40-year gap between solo albums. So apparently this album sold pretty well, but I was not aware of it. 1977, I was, well, I know I'm not going to give my age away, but I was in my teens, let's say. But I'm not sure if it made much of an impact in the UK. However, that's based on radio listening. So my awareness of pop and rock at the time was very much through Radio 1, particularly the BBC Radio 1. So unless there were singles that got Radio 1 airplay, I would have missed it, or unless there were albums that were really well known. But I don't think even as I've got older and I know a lot more about the albums that were around in the 70s, it's not one that I've particularly encountered. So I wonder if that meant it had better penetration in the States than in the UK. I would describe this as being pop rock, maybe singer-songwriter. Well, it is singer-songwriter in that he sings and he's a songwriter, and in that he uses a variety of different instruments and different feels here. But I'm less happy with that. And I feel that the reason for that is because it feels too big. And that's an interesting thought to have, because that implies that I think the singer-songwriter shouldn't feel, or doesn't generally feel, as big as this. And it does have a big sound to it. Normally, I listen to an album twice. So what I do is I do as uninformed a listen as I can get. And that's what I call the blind listen. And then I read some stuff about the album and about the act, and then I have a second listen, so I get an informed listen. On this occasion, I actually ended up listening 3 times, partly because I liked it, partly because I wasn't sure I paid a lot of attention in my first listen. And I'm glad that I did, because it was actually on my third listen that I felt that I really started to understand it as an album and get a handle on it. As I said before, it's got a big sound. So what's happening here is there's lots of different instruments, but the thing that gives it this width is a strong presence of orchestra, but it's not handled in the way orchestra often was in the 70s, I think. It's very texturally done, but textures that are different. So textures of something like Patsy Cline songs with the orchestra in the background. So sometimes this is strings. Sometimes there's kind of massed brass sounds, which are particularly interesting feel. It gives the whole thing this kind of expansive, rich width to it that I think is quite unusual. I think there's quite a lot going on, particularly in. So if you take frequency ranges being very low down here to very high up here, in what I would think of as being the lower mid range. So not the bass, but getting into the lower bits here. And then I think that's where you get this thickness of feel. And I think there's a lot of actually quite subtle production going on, which is, for 1977, was, I would say, ahead of its time. It's a thing that happens a lot now, is that you've got stuff where you've got, okay, if you listen really carefully, you might hear a little plinky guitar somewhere in the background, and they've barely used it and barely put it in the mix. And it's just there filling out the detail in the background. And there's quite a lot of that going on in this album. Musically, it's sometimes, for I guess fairly obvious reasons, it reminded me of the Beach Boys, in chord progressions, but also some of the harmonies. It reminded me more strongly of some of Paul McCartney's solo stuff. And in production, it kept reminding me of the Alan Parsons project, but that's based on the richness and the kind of rhythms and the way it's approached. But this it's got a richer sound than the Alan Parsons stuff because it's got real instruments rather than synths. There's also a fair bit of piano going on here. His voice is strong. He's got quite an emotive voice at times. Sometimes he reminded me of Peter Gabriel's voice, particularly of the kind of Us uh, era stuff. And it's not what I expected from somebody who was a Beach Boy. It has more depth to it. And some people argue, no, Beach Boys have got lots of depth. It has more pathos to it. There's more kind of feeling, and it's got a presence of sort of different kind of presence. And I guess I might say this was a yacht rock feel if anybody wants to put that label on it. I really liked it. There's a lot to dig into. I was glad for my third listen. As I said, it won me over. At first, my thoughts were that maybe it's somebody who's, because sometimes there are problems with somebody who's been in a band, comes and tries to do something solo, and maybe they're not feeling very sure what to do, and so but they've already had quite a bit of success, so they've got the money to throw a lot of production at it and do that. And so at first I thought there's a lot of production going on here, but then it won me over, and it clicked into place in my mind, and I kind of went, yeah. I really enjoy this album. So that's what I think of the album. As always, at this point, I'd love to ask you what you think of the album. So I will. What do you think of this album? Can you let me know, please, by leaving me a comment? But that's it from me for now.